Hey, my name is Sagar from DataCoil, and this is going to be on OAuth. And before we look into what OAuth actually is and how does this work, we want to make sure that we understand what are the problem we are trying to solve with it. And the problem is of authorizing our API. Just so that all of us are on the same page, authorization concerns with what someone is allowed to do, and it deals with things like permission and access control. Maybe a user is allowed to read a file but not change it or edit it. It could be an example of authorization. Versus authentication, which concerns with verifying an identity, confirming who they say they are, and it is usually implemented with a combination of username and password or email address and password. Let's take an example. Let's say there is a frame app that takes data from Facebook. The data could be our profile picture, and output it as framed profile picture. So one of those things we might have seen on Facebook, right? I support Donald Trump or whatever. And as Facebook, we are concerned with how we can give proper permission to this frame app. One example might be, maybe this app is allowed to read the profile picture of a user, but not add the status or change profile picture or send link to everyone, those kind of things. So these are the things we're dealing with, and we are, as Facebook, we are interested in how our system interacts with frame app. So there are a couple of ways to solve this. The simplest example is probably sharing the credentials. This means, as a user, when we open an account on frame app, we give maybe username and password of our Facebook account. That means this app, this frame app, can go through our Facebook account and almost extract profile picture from it. But there are some problems with it. The first problem we might run into is there is no way to restrict access. So our application can do pretty much everything. The second problem we might face is of user impersonation, and this includes we have no idea to tell if a user is using it or an API is using it. The third problem can arise with the issue on change in password. This means if we change our Facebook password, we almost have to go through our app. This means if we change our Facebook password, we have to go to the app and update the maybe password field for Facebook account so that our app can access Facebook next time. The other problem we might arise is in the case when application get compromised. Let's say our frame app got compromised and we actually have a given password field for Facebook in it. So that means, let's say a hacker can pretty much compromise our Facebook account. Also, it is impossible to implement two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication because, well, even if we do that on Facebook, our app will not be able to access what it wants to access. And of course, there is a problem of user credentials that are exposed. It's almost like our application needs to store these credentials in order to prevent continuously asking for user for credentials or password. And we almost have to implement like a non-reversal password hashing algorithm, which might not be a really good way to do these things. Cookies also can help us solve this problem. So basically, cookies are a small piece of text that is sent to browser whenever unsuccessful login. So let's say we logged in to Facebook. We entered our email and password and we logged into Facebook. And let's say if we wanted to perform some action on Facebook, that means maybe scrolling the news feed or going someone's else profile. In order to perform those actions, we need to preserve the state of user. So I am actually who is making the request rather than someone else. In order to avoid asking user every time to enter email and password every time he or she performs an action, we can use cookies. So user enter credentials and user gets a response which has a cookie, and the response include set cookie header that contains cookie name, value, expiry time, and some other information. But the problem of this when trying to authorize is that we might run into cross-site request forgery attacks. The idea is, if a user opens another tab in browser and tries to access the same API, they will still be authorized. And this goes for any other application running in that browser. So it's almost like we have authorized browser instead of authorizing application. API keys could solve that problem. So API key are unique identifier that authenticate request, and they are also used for authorization, and it's quite popular even today, and a lot of systems still rely on this. So users enter key that was given to API, right? A user has option to generate API keys, so we do not need to pass user credentials to our frame app. Also, we can implement multi-factor authentication, and we can generate one key per application, and we can implement the scopes for every key. It also has some issues that we have to think about. So there is no standard design method, there is no fixed specification how and on which format API key are generated and verified. Also, there can be issue with expiry of API keys. So maybe we want our keys to expire in a day, or expire in a month, or expire in a year, or expire every 30 minutes. The other thing might be it only can identify projects but not the users. And although these are problems that we can work around, there is even a better way that is designed to solve this problem. That is OAuth. So it's an authorization framework for HTTP APIs, and it provides security delegate scoped API access. I mean, user define exact part of API that they want the application to use. There is a fairly standard way to implement OAuth in our applications. These are the 4 components of OAuth. The first one is a resource. It could be an API to read files, or it could be an API to write files, and this is protected by the server. The second one is client app, frame app in our example, and it requests the resource. The third one is user, who is the resource owner, that means us. And fourth one is authorization server, which handles authorization requests, and this server is trusted by all concerned parties. So first of all, client application sends authorization request to authorization server, and this is usually done from browser. The user gets redirected from client app to authorization server. As the authorization requests get validated, authorization server asks user to verify identity, then consent. There are magnitude of ways we can implement authentication in our application. It could be some combination of email address or password, or even login through Facebook or Google. All of these things can use to establish authentication, and this is beyond the scope of OAuth specification. This is an example of how it would look like. So let's say this is login screen of our frame app, and we can authenticate with Facebook. And once we click authenticate, this is the screen that we can enter our email and password into, and next to it we ask for consent, something like this. So our application can receive our name and profile picture and email address. This is an example of setting consent. So this solves few problems right away. User credentials is removed from client, and we can use multi-user authentication or two-step authentication in order to authenticate our user. Once that is done, the user is then redirected to client app with something called authorization grant. With this grant, client application now act on behalf of user. Authorization grant is implemented in form of random value that only authorization server can understand. After this happens, client's application sends backend request to OAuth server not using the browser. On the request, it contains information about the authorization grant that is obtained and some way to authenticate itself as valid client. The authorization server processes the request, and if authorization grant is correct and it identifies client application as valid client, access token is generated. It's almost like we are swapping grant for access token, and only the application that received the grant can request for access token. After receiving the access token, client application can send request to protected resource. In this case, we are requesting for profile picture from Facebook, and it has some way to verify access token, and if everything is correct, we get returned our response which contains photo. So this is one example of typical OAuth flow, although alternative to this are possible as per requirement. Few things I would like to add here. OAuth is far better way to authorize due to scope access. We have option to specify the permissions, and it can be passed to OAuth flow at some keyword, or again implement details can vary. It doesn't define specifically the access token format, access token validation, user authentication, and the implementation can vary, and those are in the domain of client application. And we can extend OAuth as per requirement. Let's say we want to add identity specification, we can use OpenID Connect. So yeah, that's all for now, and I'll see you guys to it. The other thing, very quickly, we just started this channel and we were on this dire need for a logo, and I think at this point I'd like to introduce to our friend Anish, who helped us design our logo for the channel. He's such a talented person and it was a pleasure to work with him. So if you guys have any logo / design requirements, feel free to keep in touch. This is his LinkedIn profile. Again, really talented, pleasure to work with.